Hi, good afternoon. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Nasher's 360 Speaker Series. I'm Curator of Education, Anna Smith, and today I'm pleased to introduce artist Barbara Kasten. Before we begin our talk, take a look at the back of your program where you'll find information on our next 3 events, featuring artists Elm Green and Dragset on September 14th, Nicole Eisenman on September 21st, and that one has a beer and brat reception, so don't miss that one, and artist Anne Latraterre on October 26th. After today's talk, I invite you to continue the conversation over a glass of wine just outside on the lower level landing. We're very excited to bring you artist Barbara Kasten today. As a sculpture museum, we don't often have the opportunity to showcase the work of a photographer, but as you'll see today, Kasten's manipulation of the objects and environments in front of her lens produces some of the most sculptural images you'll ever have the pleasure to see. Kasten is a John Simon Guggenheim Fellow, NEA grant recipient, and a Fulbright Hays Fellow. In 2015, her survey exhibition, Barbara Kasten Stages, originated at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Philadelphia, then traveled to the Graham Foundation in Chicago and MoCA in Los Angeles. Her work has been featured globally, including in the Sharjah Biennial 14, Tate Modern, Museum of Modern Art Frankfurt, Tokyo Metro Museum of Photography, MoMA, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Guggenheim Museum, and the Smithsonian American Art Museum, among many others. 2 of Kasten's large Polaroid photographs are currently on view at the warehouse as part of the exhibition, The Sensation of Space, which was co-organized in partnership with the Nasher. The warehouse has graciously offered to host an open house from 3:30 to 5:30 p.m. today so that everyone here can enjoy Kasten's work in the context of the exhibition. We're delighted to have her here today, and I'm eager for her to share her work with you all. Please join me now in welcoming Barbara Kasten.
Well, it's wonderful to see so many people who ventured out on a Saturday to come in and listen to me. I hope I don't disappoint you. and really, it was a really wonderful invitation to become a participant in the warehouse show in that context of sculpture. And because most of my work is related to sculpture, and it was really nice to be included in this very well-received lecture series that Anna has put together here at the Nasher. So this is a wonderful thrill for me, too, to be here and come back to Dallas. I was here a couple of years ago, so I know it a little bit, not much, but a little. So what I've done here is put together kind of a survey, but not in chronological order. What I've done is try to bring together some aspects of the work that relate to each other across the years, 49 years. And so there are relationships that are obvious and maybe some that are not, and perhaps you'll see others, but it gave me an opportunity to have a little mixing of the work and a little different point of view to talk about. So here is what I put together, and it starts with the most recent. Let me see, I gotta get this right. At Crown Hall this last summer, I did a sculptural installation of work. Crown Hall, for those of you who might not remember or think about, is the Mies van der Rohe building, the structure that he made at Illinois Institute of Technology. And it's a freestanding, unsupported structure. And so it has this glorious space and beautiful ambient light. And in the summertime, the students leave. In the winter, or the academic year, they use the space as a studio. So normally this big space is filled with work tables that the students are laboring over. But what I did was use the open space as my studio to sort of reference their work system. And also I use the tables that they work on. So these are constructions made from the student tables with the addition of color plexi that I added. The intent here was to pay homage to Mies van der Rohe, to Moholy Nagy, who also came to IIT and was very important in the education and changing our look at how to educate in the arts. And myself, I wanted to kind of just have a conversation with these two men who I greatly admire. So what I did was, it was about 6 weeks, I guess, that I had there. And every day I would go in, every day that I could manage to go in and work, I did. And I made, the first time around, I made a sculpture, stacked up these tables. None of these sculptures are permanent. They're reliant on each other for stability and balance. So it's a very kind of architectural approach as well. And so I would work on a sculpture. The next time I came back, I would add another sculpture. And then the third time I came back, I started mixing them up. So nobody, meaning the sculptures, lasted entirely the whole 8 weeks. They just became a kind of a rotating experiment in form and in construction, which is what I do in the studio before I photograph. That whole situation led to an invitation to make a full stage sculpture for something called a marathon, which Hans Ulrich Obrich conducts as an interview with people in various cities. And his whole concept is based on Studs Terkel, who was from Chicago and a great interviewer. So what he did is he came to Chicago, sponsored by the Humanities, Chicago Humanities, Creative Humanities, and the Terra Foundation. And he selected like maybe 20 or 30 people in the arts, not just artists, but curators and others to question on stage, and not question, but interview with a partner. So he needed a backdrop, and what I did, I was commissioned to make the backdrop. So this is what I did, and it's again those tables. And I also then constructed beams out of that plexi material in the form of industrial girders or anything that related to the structure. This is where it was presented, and at Navy Pier, and it's at the end of the pier, and it had great light, and it was an all-day long event, and people rotated through so you could come and go. But for me, it was preparation for this sculpture for months ahead of time. And then what we had to do is put it up for an afternoon, and they gave us 2 hours in which to reconstruct it. It was constructed in the studio, 2 hours to bring it to Navy Pier, put it up, and then they gave us 20 minutes to take it down. So you can see the planning in this had to be pretty tight. This is Hans with 3 members of the Harry Who were from Chicago, very important painters, and their work was on display at that time at the Art Institute. This is based on that same material, the plexiglass, which is a kind of special plexiglass because it's made of fluorescent material, and it has a glowing edge. And back in the 80s, in my heyday, it was very prevalent, and a lot of people used it for signage and more common kinds of things. But now there's only these colors available. And the plexi itself, the properties of the plexi, it's not very strong. It kind of bends if it's too big and if it's at a different angle, but it becomes extremely strong when it's constructed in a form like a box. So I use that concept, that idea that the material itself sort of dictated to make these long kinds of boxes. And then they're stacked one upon another without any kind of pins or anything to hold them together. Again, it's another balance kind of thing. So all the sculpture is very movable and very changeable and based a lot in how it can stand on its own. Even the sculptures I do in the studio, I work with them until they find their own place to stand. And then they stay for a long time. You can walk by, you can put a fan on them. They don't come down because they kind of they settle into their own places. So this was and is now the kind of the progression I've been making to showing sculptures that stand alone and are not photographed. For many years, I photographed sculptures and never showed the sculpture, or if I did, it was more of an installation. I'll show you some pictures. Anyway, so now I'm making real, three-dimensional, self-sustaining sculpture. That's why I'm so happy to be here. I feel like I came home. So anyhow, let me see. Wrong button. Okay, here's another something that came from the dictation of that material and a combination with photography. So this is somewhat of a hybrid. What you're looking at is a side view of a photograph that I made of those plexi pieces in a constructed form. I made the photograph, I framed it, it's face mounted into a plexi box, and then on top of it, I've used the same material to create a relief-like sculptural form. So these are a few examples of what's happening there. And in doing so, I've used the illusion that's possible through photography, but I've also created a three-dimensional form, and then when a spotlight is put on it, which is essential, there's another form that is cast on top of it by the shadows. So it kind of is an interplay of all these three mediums that I've been working with all these years. I feel like it's kind of the epitome of where I was going, and a combination of the concepts that I was really trying to work with. So they're not that large. They're like 36 inches by 36 inches. But they do overlap. You can see what happens when the light hits it on the wall and the edges. And a lot of what you're looking at is not there when the light's not there. So it's all dependent, again, on the lighting source, both in the photograph and in the sculptures. They're unique, and it really, my sculptural concepts and ideas came from way back in actually the 70s, but here are some sculptures that reminded me of the previous work that I just showed you that I did in 1982 for a show in Japan. And it, again, was sculpture based on movable parts, on parts I used in the photographs, but these were not made to be photographed. These were made to be presented independently. But again, as always, dependent on the light, and in this case, on colored light, because the sculpture elements themselves are white. They're plaster forms or wooden forms that I create, and I use both in the photographs and in the sculpture. So I never throw anything away. These same elements you'll see in the most recent work I did last week. That's where I'm at. That's a lot of storage, but it works. And I like using and reconfiguring and a familiar kind of form or texture or material. Materials are really the basis of the work and usually dictate what happens in the work. So these are about maybe 7 feet high. Unfortunately, these didn't make the storage, so I don't have them anymore. I've thought I've thought about reconstructing them, but instead of doing that, I'm just making new sculptures. Coming from that, why is this not, am I pointing it in the right direction maybe? Yeah, okay, this was another project that came using found objects and using the same concept, but on a much larger scale. This was at Wright State University, and those pyramids came from the San Francisco Opera. They were discarding some of their props, and I was there in San Francisco doing the Cap Street project, which is a house that at the time was artists were invited to live and to make work and then present it in the house. It was in San Francisco near Market Street. David Ireland was the artist who built the house and was the beginning of the project. Now I think it's gone on to be part of the Wattis Institute. I'm not sure what happened to the house or what they're doing with it. But at that time, I wanted to present my photographs, but I also wanted to create an environment. Now, none of these were used to make a photograph, again, but the students at Wright State used them in their drawing classes. So I love the fact that they have these multiple purposes and lives, and they're really non-permanent. They're installations. They don't exist anymore. But it was a great sort of theatrical presentation that I'm also very fond of. As you can see, like even in the marathon, that was a very kind of theatrical staging, but this was, earlier. So I put this in to remind myself to talk about the material aspect and how it is so important in my work. And these are this is really my first photographic work. And they're photograms. I was married to a photographer who curated a show on Moholy's photograms back in the 70s, and I had an opportunity to see Moholy's work really close up and personal. At that time, it wasn't the sacred thing. They were photographs to begin with. Nobody kind of respected photography in the same way they do now. And they didn't respect Moholy in the same way they do now. So we were given a box of photograms from a collector in Philadelphia, and we drove them cross country for his exhibition in California, and brought them in every night to the hotel room and put them back in the trunk of the car and drove on. So, curators, I could see them all cringing already. It's like, how could you do that? But it was interesting, too, to me that the Guggenheim show of Moholy that was in New York a year or so ago, I was invited to speak, and in that show were some of these very same photograms that we had transported. But that all to say that Moholy was a great inspiration to me, not so much before I did these, but as a discovery after I did these. Because my intent with these was really to record a fiberglass material in a way that made it unlike what it really was, which was rough and industrial. These look ephemeral and beautiful, but it's that kind of play between reality and abstraction that I feel I'm always trying to balance. I'm always trying to work toward. And this was, one of the very earliest ways that I did it. I'm enthralled with photograms. I've done them throughout my career in various places, locations, and forms. But these are very special to me. And the reason I did them, I didn't come from a photo background. I didn't have any training in photography. And so what I was really interested in when I did these was I was looking for a way to integrate photography in its essence, in its true form, into painting. At the time, and you could probably see it in here, the painters of the day were stain kind of painters, had Frankenthaler, people like that who were using the kind of liquid to move around to make and create shapes on the canvas. Well, that's what I did with these, but I wanted it to also have a photographic inclusion, a means of including reality, which comes from the photogram recording a real thing, to this painting kind of technique that I was really more interested in than the photograph. I just wanted to make them work together. And that's a whole series that this came about from that. In 1972, I went to Poland. That's me. And you can see me, I'm surrounded by these kind of sculptural figures, which is what I did there. I was on a Fulbright. I was, well, you had to have a mentor, so I actually had Magdalena Abakanowicz, whose sculpture you see out in the garden, as my mentor. And she didn't want me to work in her studio. She sent me off to Poznań, which is another town outside of Warsaw, where there was an art school, and I was allowed to just continue my own experimentation. And you might notice, this is 1972. Her works with seated forms, I'm not putting her down, believe me, but she didn't start those till after I did these. So, we all influence each other. And the boundaries that we cross are so fluid, I mean, an artist can influence what? A food person, I mean, it's like wonderful to let our artistic experimentations float out in the world and become different sources for different people. And so I'm happy that she picked up on it and ran with it. I didn't. I went in another direction. But these were, as you can see, based on sort of stereotypical body forms, and they're all hand-woven. I wove them on a big frame loom, and then I pulled the warp strings so that I could create three-dimensional form. And I found chairs that they could sit in various ways. This probably is one of the first installations where I showed photographs and sculpture. So here, these are the forms I did in Poland, and this is at California College of Arts and Crafts, where I got my graduate degree in fiber textiles, from a Bauhaus influenced teacher, a Bauhaus trained teacher, actually, Trude Germonpré. She was a second generation Bauhaus person, and she came to the States to replace Annie Albers at Black Mountain when Annie was on sabbatical. And then she was invited to start this program at California College of Arts and Crafts. And that's where I really got to meet her and know her, and had great influence from her. But so these are, the photographs are these, and they are, again, sort of another interpretation of the body in a chair, but done with a photograph. Probably the most figurative things I've done. That might not be exactly true, because I did do some things in the 90s, but I don't have them in this lecture to show you. But these are done with a process called diazotype, which is, again, an architectural kind of medium. And they were published by the Graham Foundation in a book during the exhibition from ICA. These were in the exhibition, and they wanted to publish a special book just focused on these pieces. So there is one out in the world. Hardly available, though, because they were signed in a small edition, and I don't think there's too many available. But it's nice to have them documented. The real thing is very fugitive. That diazotype doesn't last like a cyanotype. A cyanotype is much more permanent emulsion, but a diazotype was never meant to be permanent. It was just for architects to draw and present their plans with. So in the 80s, however, I went from the photogram to the studio, but it was really almost a step, because it wasn't an abrupt step. What I was doing on the photograms at this time, I had a dark room, a big dark room, available to me because my ex-husband was a photographer, and I had mural paper, photographic mural paper, and I set it up on the floor in the darkroom, and I set boxes and forms on top of it, lit it, and created shadows. And with that idea, it dawned on me, I could do it in the studio, but I would have to photograph it because it's in the studio. But Polaroid came along and presented this new material to the photographic community in color. And color was kind of new at the time. It was much more commercial product, and Polaroid made it a much more acceptable art form, and they provided a lot of opportunity for artists to go and experiment with it. So they built a huge collection because they invited us into the studio. Those two at the warehouse are made with the studio that Polaroid had as a 20 by 24 camera. I actually have a couple pictures of that. But back to what I was doing, it was that I was again using industrial materials. I was again relying on the properties of the material, but so there's a bit of reality in here when you see the edge of a glass, and the shape is cut to reflect colors that are around the periphery of the setup that you can't see. And so I really approached it as a painter. I looked at the back of the ground glass as if it were a piece of paper or a canvas, and I wanted to move the shapes around. I would get into the set and do that. These are not tabletop. These are actually kind of 3 feet high pieces of glass and a setup that is more looking like an installation than you might imagine. Because it's so hard to tell the scale on a photograph, you might imagine these are small, but they're not. So what that brought me to was this involvement with the sculpture and the photograph as kind of a performance. I was stepping into the set, which I called it the set, which is, kind of a photographic term, but also a staging idea, and moving things around to suit what I wanted on the back of the ground glass. So I didn't move the camera. I didn't find ways of different points of view. I actually rearranged whatever it was I wanted to see in the camera in front of me. So here I am in my New York studio. I lived in New York for a while, too. I went from Chicago to Arizona with my parents in the 50s, went on to the University of Arizona and then to California, where I spent about 10 years. And then, and I went to school in San Francisco. And then I moved to New York. So I've kind of lived in very interesting places at interesting times. Because in California, it was the space movement, the light and space movement. And so that was a great influence on me. And then in New York, I had the Polaroid studio, and that was a very active art scene. And now Chicago is really becoming a very important center of artistic young talent and a lot going on. So I feel like I've really been lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time. So here are some of the Polaroids, the 20 by 24s that were made from objects that I, retained from the past or found. Like this is a piano leg. I just anything I found of interest, I kind of transformed its purpose and put it into another context. And also the abstraction kind of now is more in the idea of a concrete photograph where the idea comes from your concept, not from trying to transform a realistic form into an abstraction, as the modernists might have done, where you could see elements of a real object being reiterated in different shapes or overlaid. I was really looking at this as a three-dimensional construction that I could paint if I chose to paint. But with painting, you don't get that reality. You don't get the sense of a real thing. So that's where the photography came in. And I liked the balance of doing that. My process was more of a painter's process, but my presentation, my object in the end was a photograph. So, and this is a few shots of the Polaroid studio as it was in Cambridge, and then they had a studio in New York, and I would have to, before I moved to New York, I actually did things in their Cambridge studio, and I would have to pre-plan and bring in elements to photograph and then set up this tableau. So this is kind of the scale of the objects that I photograph. And this was in the studio, their studio. I relied on the color. Everything that I made was in a neutral tone, so I relied on the color, and I looked for kind of painterly aspects, kind of like that bleed from the shadow, and the mix of colors that came from the different colored gels over the lights. And I'm also looking downward at this corner set that you saw, and I'm looking downward to eliminate any sense of horizon so that it flattens in a way, and then the objects and the shadows become the elements that bring you into the space. This screening material, this gray, that's the same stuff that was in the photograms. These are all mirrors. I made little kind of sculptural elements to put in, like this kind of zigzaggy form. There are others that had more forms to them that were more constructed. But I let the idea, like these things were constructed. I like the idea that it really it translated so differently in a photograph than it did in reality. And I was trying to juxtapose both of those things, the fact that here's this industrial tube, but it makes, and with the light, it makes a shadow that becomes very cursive and beautiful. So the light, again, is the element. You could look at this without the light, and it wouldn't be very interesting. But as soon as you put the light on it, it is. So here's an example from the 80s when the photographs are on the wall. They're 8x10 Polaroids, which is what I was doing in the studio. And then this is the setup that came from the studio but was never photographed. It was just an example showing how the lighting and the materials mingled in what I was interested, the materiality that I was interested in. This is another set that was much larger at Cal State University, where I did an exhibition of like a 30-foot long set, and I did photograph in it. I photographed segments of it, and they became a series of 8x10 Polaroids. This is a few times I showed these installations in gallery setups. This is one time where that happened. So you can see they're very stage-like. And this is the Cap Street project, where I wanted to, where I lived, and I showed the photographs, but I wanted to make more of an installation of the entire first floor of the house. And I did, but that wasn't enough for me. I really love the Bauhaus and the interdisciplinary processes that they mixed. And so I invited a dance company to perform in this Cap Street project. And they, in turn, then invited me to make a stage set for BAM, which was the Brooklyn Academy of Music. It was the Margaret Jenkins Dance Company. And these are elements that I made, similar to what I might make in my photographic sets, and they were all movable. I was able to design the costumes. I was able to work with the lighting designer to have lighting changes. And so it was like a huge picture of my studio, only in large scale, and movement. The Bauhaus had dance, they had sculpture, they had photography, they did everything and anything they wanted. And I wanted to be in that same position. So I was lucky that I was able to do some of it. Now this is a short clip that I did where I actually was kind of the performer. I allowed my audience to be the performer. So this is noisy. So obviously that's video, and so that's where this whole movement idea took me, is not only to do this sort of installation of, there were 3 videos in there, and people walked into it was like being in a dance floor, because the lights were moving, and they were really, it was very fun to see people enjoying the kind of movement and the sound. But it also allowed me to use the video as movement in another space. So I've continued, and I'll show you a couple more videos and sculpture combinations. But it also, the scale of both of these projects is relatable to what I did in the 80s in the actual architecture of several buildings where I installed big mirrors in the view camera's sight lines that reflected back on the architecture. So here's the Equitable building in New York, and all these had to be photographed at night. They required a huge production both in preparation and also in execution, because I had like 12 people helping me. And I had to use professional lighting people from the movie industry, because the photo industry their lights were not big enough, and I needed big 10K lights, and I needed men to move them around. And so it was a much slower process, but it also had to be extremely well planned, because you don't take a crew of 12 people overnight into a well-known building that you've negotiated to use and then look for something to photograph. It all had to be done in advance. And so what you're looking at here is in the E.F. Hutton building, looking upward into their ceiling of their atrium, and mirrors are reflecting back onto the architecture. Now, this whole project came about from Vanity Fair's invitation to make photographs for an article on postmodern architecture, and I opted to photograph the interiors, the lobbies, which with postmodernism, the whole big, wonderful interior that you walk into in an entrance was very prevalent, still is. But I wanted to make a commentary, both politically as well, about what some of these purposes of these institutions were, and many of them were financial institutions. Like this. This is the World Financial Center. It's not the World Trade Center. It was across the street. But so we lit at night with these multiple colors, and then this is a mirror, a circular mirror that reflected the dome-like building, so it looks like a ball rolling down the stairs. And it's very playful, but it also is kind of like talking about the frivolousness of our institution, our financial institution. And so, it kind of filled a little edge that I think actually abstraction has, which is to have us perceive things in an entirely different way. Abstraction is really a political tool. It was used that way in the past, in the Bauhaus, in constructivism. And it's not usually talked about in that dimension, but I think it is. And I think these are probably an example of how that can work. It's very subtle, but it's there. This is Richard Meyer's High Museum in Atlanta, which is totally white, and I don't think he would have liked it this way. But however, many of this is the setup for that photograph. You can see the size of the lights. I actually used a beautiful sculpture to reflect in the mirror that incorporated that in the photograph. But there were people real architects who really liked what I was doing. Some of them hesitated, like Frank Gehry, because he thought I was kind of like using his art to make art, which in a sense I was, but that, that's done all the time. So, it's sort of like proprietary. You have to kind of, he got around to it being okay, but at first it was like, wait a minute, what are you doing here? But I had to get permission, so it didn't have to come from him, though. It had to come from the Loyola Law School, because they owned the building. But Isozaki, who designed this, I went to Japan for that show, and he welcomed me in open arms. I mean, he brought out the green tea, and he did, it was like a really different reception to this exchange of creativity and creative ideas. So he was very open. And so this is the plaza of MoCA, the week it opened, actually. And all the color, like from inside the pyramid shape, comes from big lights that we rolled in there with colored gel over it. And these are mirrors. And if you could see behind the mirrors, you'd see a construction that's like holding it upright. So it's not, they're not standing on their own, although they look like they are. It's a lot of, on the periphery, there's a lot of what you saw in that photograph at the High Museum, a lot of metal arms and objects that hold the works in place. This was the LA County Museum. It's a pavilion, the Japanese pavilion, and the mirror here is in that upper right-hand corner. The rest is the sculptural aspects of the architecture itself. This was also at MoCA, and this one was at the Whitney Museum. So when, well, I'll go on and tell you that later, but okay, so that's led me to, again, scale and movement plus scale. And in the ICA show, I did this video. When the show then went on to the Graham Foundation, they didn't have a 30-foot high corner like ICA did, so I designed another sculpture or video with sculpture. This one I don't have in a video to show you, but this is the construction. It's again a corner stage set, and there are real objects here, real cubes and forms that were photographed as well, not in this exact position, but the same elements were photographed and videotaped. And then when this was played, the video was played over this stage set, it became this exchange of real and unreal. You weren't quite sure if it was the video you were looking at that was three-dimensional or if it was the real form that was actually physically there. So, and that seems to be sort of the basis of almost everything that I try to do it's not to fool the eye, it's not an illusion, but it's an exchange about perception, really. And so this went through a variation of colors that were based on a day's cycle of morning, noon, evening kind of colorations. And they built up. There's very few physical pieces in this set. Most of what you're looking at is a photographic video over the set. And this is to show you, this is like not even built yet. I'm working on it. But this is the drawing, the proposal of a sculpture, not that I photographed, with some of those very same elements that you've seen all along the way, especially the one that was right before this. Some of those blocks were used to create a long sculpture of these elements. I photographed them, and now they're being put into a file that's going to be printed on glass. And it's 60 feet long, and it's going to have 11 panels of glass. So I think I'm really getting up there in scale. But it's also a wonderful opportunity to see the work, and I relate it in a lot of ways to the cyanotypes I did earlier. The constructions are, from my studio concepts. It's kind of like I always end back doing something that's very comfortable, and that usually means it has some inclusion of a past idea or a past material that I've been interested in working with. So this is yet to happen, and it'll be probably in March of next year that it's up. And this was the original photograph that's based on. This is the sculpture that I photographed to make that drawing. And then going back to the different videos, this was the MoCA presentation of stages. And again, the configuration, the architecture dictated the kind of video that could be shown. At ICA, it was the 30-foot high corner. In Graham Foundation, it was a mansion with a different feel totally, and a stage set that kind of filled their big open auditorium space. And then at the Pacific Design Center in LA, where this was shown, there was this open skylight. It wasn't actually a skylight, it was covered over, but it had been intended for the natural light, but it no longer did. And so I used that corner for another video that moved, rotating the corner, the colors in that. This is just a few views of that. So it's really important, for me when I do a video or an installation, that the architecture becomes part of the dialogue, so that it's no longer, it can exist in a white box, but it's more interesting if it talks to the white box, if it talks to the sculpture, if there's some interchange. And so I, kind of prefer that. Here are some photographs that came around the same time that reflect that video and the way, the shapes and the forms and the shadows that are projected from that. So these are simple cardboard boxes. Again, a very common material. And you can see imperfections in the material, the scratches on the plexi or the tears in the cardboard. And I want all of that to give you a sense of the real form. I mean, after all, with a photo, you can't make a photograph without having a real object. You have to photograph something, because that's the way photography is made to be. It should be, and it is. Now, there are people who don't look at abstraction in the same way I do, and there are many forms of abstraction and many ways to achieve it. But a lot of people in photography use the process as their means to abstraction and color, whereas I use it in I think, a different way. And these go back to the very beginning, but they reflect the same sort of aesthetic and the same point of view about plexi and materials. And so we have here in this photogram on top of an enlargement of a photograph made in the studio. So it's again a composite, which is why I called it amalgam. And it's a plexi box on top of an enlargement that was made in the studio and light projected, and then I painted on some of them. So it again combined 3 different mediums, 3 different disciplines, 3 different ways of working, and 3 different ways of presenting spatial ambiguities and spatial concerns. So these are really like photograms. When you see the box up there and the reflection on the wall, it's really the light projecting a shape on the wall. So it's a photogram. And these are window screens, straight off the, windows that were holding back the mosquitoes. And the same material that was in the photograms, but this time stretched. These came along just more recently, again with this fluorescent plexi that I have discovered and used a lot and really find very interesting. I don't just use it once. I mean, you can see, I didn't put the date on this, but this is 2016, and I'm still using it. So I never kind of feel like a material has said all it has to say. I really kind of find other ways to make sure I can, push and pull it in another direction. But basically, I let it tell me a lot about itself. And it's always through the translation of light. The light is so important in all of these because you're looking at some objects and you're looking at some shadows of the objects. And again, back to this reality versus abstraction and a painterly surface, because this is a flat surface. Photographs are flat. They're like paintings. But paintings rely on the eye and the hand, and what I'm doing is I'm trying to push it to rely on the photographic illusion and the reality of an object that a camera can capture. And this is a triptych that I'll be showing in March of next year in Germany. I have an exhibition scheduled at the Kunst Museum in Wolfsburg, and it's a survey, not a retrospective, a survey. And they are publishing, though, a 225-page book, so it's going to be quite extensive reading, but it's thrilling for me because it's my first real museum exposure in Europe. Europeans have been very open to the work and very supportive, but it's the first time that I'll be showing in that context. This is kind of going back to the staging idea and the use of the screening material. And it all came about when I retired from teaching. I came back to Chicago, where I was born, in 1998 for personal reasons, family reasons, and also I had a great job offer. I was 60 years old, and I thought I better take this job, because it's not going to come along very well and easily. So I did, and it was a really interesting experience for about 10, 12 years. And they were also very supportive, and they gave me an award that allowed me to have a studio that they sponsored, the school, Columbia College, Chicago. And they also gave me time off from teaching. So I was able to get back into the studio because in the 90s, for various reasons, I traveled more and photographed in institutions and used collections to photograph with. And it was different. It was abstract, but it was an abstraction of real artifacts and objects. I did a project in Turkey. I did a project at Cornell University. The 80s were more centered on specific locations. But when I came back to teach, and I had this studio, I got back into it. And since I had been teaching in a school that sort of emphasized more documentary approach to photography, I thought to myself, okay, what is the question I now want to examine? And that is, can you make an abstract photograph? because as I said, you need an object. And I didn't want to use an object that was identifiable as a thing, as an artifact. I went completely the other direction from the 90s. So I started using these screens again, objects that were industrial, but had scratches to show the real presence of an object, but not really. Used clear plexi because you could see through it, but still it had physicality. When a light hit it, it became a shadow and a shape. So I explored this whole concept of working abstractly from this marriage of sculpture and photography and the things that really are basic to both space for the sculpture and form, and for photography, the idea that a shadow can be recorded as an object, which is, what the modernists did. They Autobridge, all those people with that background, they used shadow in a very important way. I talk about shadow being the most important thing rather than the light, because you can't have one without the other. And to me, the shadow is the presence of light. And it's the thing I can create to kind of work ambiguously with space, and I can define a real piece of material, and it still doesn't have any metaphoric or representational value. These came when I decided I needed to add some color back in after working more monochromatically. Like, those were color photographs, those black and whites. They were not black and white photographs. They were really color film, color lighting for color, and so they all had a slight tonality. As you know, there's no really true white or any true black. They all have a tint to them. There's always a tone. So that's what I was using, but then I wanted to add some floating shapes. So I took the gels that were normally over my lights and put them with the plexi and angled the light in such a way where, I had created some of these sort of mysterious ghost-like forms that, again, kind of question what you're really looking at. Let's see, what do I have here? Okay. A few more of these. Okay, these were the really very earliest ones with just 2 pieces of clear plexi. 3 pieces of clear plexi. Again, just simple means to get where I wanted to go. Sometimes that's the best. The simpler, the better. You get, you kind of get down to the essence of the material. So these are all no color involved in terms of colored light or color objects, all in terms of exposure with color film. And not manipulated exposures, just, I actually did a whole series on expired film because it has a great color to it. And you can get a lot of expired film these days, so it was real easy to do. But, you can see there's scratches, there's painting. Again, mixing kind of and allowing myself to mark and make different configurations, all very abstract. These are 2 pieces of plexi and angled in a way where you only see the line, and clear plexi has color. So some of it has a blue edge and some of it has this sort of pinky white edge. So it's a color film, it's color. this fell while I was working, and I thought, I like that. And so I take advantage. It's like, that's what I'm saying. I let the material tell me, and I take advantage of the process, because I think the process of making art is really the reward for me as an artist, to be able to experiment and move things around and see it differently through a camera or physically as I put these, like the tables together. You know, I think the process is just the most important element. This is, again, scratched plexi, but the light was angled at such a way where when you see this close up, you see the blues in the scratches. You see reds in the scratches. It's the way the prism of color works. But it's not visible unless it's through the camera. It's only visible through the lens, because the lens is what adds that kind of variation, the prism. So again, something that I always say, you know, most photographers like the magic experience of the darkroom, but for me, the magic is in the studio and when a light hits a sculpture. Now, going back to the beginning, there's a series of photographs I did at Crown Hall at the same time I did the sculptures. Now, they're not of the sculptures, they're done with the same materials of the sculptures, so they're trying, in this case, I'm incorporating the building in a different way. In the sculptures, I was using the ambient space and the glowing light of the space and the architectural construction of the space. And in this case, I'm using elements like the terrazzo floor that was so shiny, it allowed reflections to happen. The frosted windows that Mies had specially made in Germany and are very expensive and precious, but they make the building glow. And so I also had to change my process to some degree, because normally I'm in the studio with no daylight and I can control the light, but I couldn't control what the daylight was going to do, whether it was going to rain, whether it was going to be sunny. So I began to work with what was available. And so these patterns of the trees, I started to incorporate them with the rigid structure of the tables. And then I added this sort of intense color, because in a way it was a commentary on the architecture being so preciously monochromatic and neutral. And I wanted to sort of shake it up a little bit. And so the color was my contribution to making this marriage of Mies and me and Maholi together. So these are printed as 50 by 60 inch series of Fujichrome. I don't normally do digital printing because it's all become too, the surface all feels too much the same to me. And yes, the photographic surface is the same too, but it allows an illusion to depth in a way that I find more workable for my images. So these are shiny photographs. And this is a piece that was done previously that I related to, where in this I'm using the same fluorescent plexi, and I'm videotaping it with a very choreographed movement in the studio, and then creating another sculpture of the same material and projecting the video over it as sort of a tableau or a stage set as well. This was shown in Germany. And that's my presentation, so I hope you enjoyed it. Good time? Yeah. So maybe there's time for a question or two? 2 questions, somebody? Anybody? Yeah. Is it on?
You have very, your creative output is like this limitless, you feel like there's like this limitless creativity within your mind, like what are some techniques to unlock the creative mind that you personally use yourself,
To unlock my mind? Or
Unlock
to make
like the creative, like the creative urges in your mind. And is there before you go in the studio or while you're in the studio, do you do certain things that, maybe, stimulate you that way?
Well, I wish I could say I was a Zen Buddhist, but I'm not. And I wish I could say there was something that did that specifically. But I think it's in a general way, everything. It's like what you read, what you eat, where you go, what you see, exhibitions, movies. It's just this accumulation of life experiences that, every time I look at something, I relate it to my work. Not every time, but there are times when I see something and I think, oh, that's an interesting thing to do. Maybe I'll try that. And it sort of gets stored in my brain. And when I'm working with a material that I think can do something interesting, that might pop back in. So I don't ever set out with a drawing that says, I'm going to make this now, except for, projects like the mural, which has to because of the technique. But I really rely on my reactions to certain materials and certain ways that light and shadow work with materials. And space. I mean, it's really intuitive. I just can't say there's any one thing that prepares me for the studio experience. Yeah. Anything? Diebenkorn? Oh, sure. I mean, I'm Californian too. Yeah. Yeah, no, really. And also his use of perspective, that tilted space, there's, I mean, as I tried to say anyway, I looked more at painting than I did at photography, except for the modernist period of photography like Moholy and other people who constructed things at that time, because actually I collected some of that work. At a time when you could collect photography reasonably, but painting, was more in my mind because I studied painting in undergraduate, and it was a time of abstract expressionism, and so all of that rubbed off on me, I think. And so when I go to exhibitions, I don't head for photography exhibitions. I usually don't go to photography exhibitions. Well, not because I don't want to. I do, but they have to have a content that I find more appealing, and it's usually not anything that is anything I would use. I'd like to go see what other people are thinking about political issues or social issues or what have you, but it's not because I can relate it to my work in a direct form. So I'm usually found more in a painting environment or a sculpture place. Hi.
Can you talk a bit more about the time that you worked as a set designer? Because I found that very fascinating.
Oh, I didn't work as a set designer. Never did. But I think I am a set designer, but in a way. But no, I never had that. I never was in that profession. It just seems that everything, or a lot of what I've done has been in a tableau style. And I think that comes from the fact that I started out making those to photograph, so it had a background. Not so much a sculpture in the round, So I think that has a lot to do with it. But I think there is a sense of design that comes from wanting to move shapes around and forms and balance, using all the formal properties that designers use, as well as any other profession that incorporates the arts. Yeah. Yeah. Wait, say that last part again. And what did you say, the last part? I didn't quite get it.
How to make sense out of abstract?
How to make sense out of abstract? I don't think you have to make sense out of abstract. I think you can enjoy it on many levels, and it can open your perception of more qualities that you might ignore if you just face it in a very realistic way. So the idea of abstraction is to, in my mind, at least the way I would like to perceive it, is that it makes you aware of your environment. It makes you, like for instance, the architectural sites. If you go back into any one of those sites, you're going to see it differently if you retain any of the photographic image I've done. And I've had the experience of being there, so I retain it even more. And in terms of the Bauhaus, it's their interdisciplinary approach that I really respected. I mean, I respect and love the work of many of the artists from that period, and the architects, and especially some of the architects like Corbusier and people like that. But it's their freedom of movement among different mediums that I really think is very valuable, and doesn't make me feel restricted to any one medium. Yeah. Yeah.
You were really generous in speaking about your process, and I really appreciate that. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the process of preparing for creating the photographs in the building, where you actually had to coordinate like teams of 12 with large lighting and things like that. Are you making like that in the studio? Can you talk a little bit about the process for preparing for those?
Preparing. Well, for instance, the architectural site things, again, they were one of the biggest production values that I've done. And I did some actually out in New Mexico in the Pueblos as well. So that was a little more, even more remote. Well, because, well, first of all, because I had Vanity Fair behind me, I could get into sites that I couldn't get into on my own, right? Once I did a series for Vanity Fair, I had something to show other people what the result might be if they allowed me to use it. But in preparation, I would go step by step, as I would go with at that time, just a snapshot camera. I would just, research all the nooks and crannies that I thought I could use. Then I would select areas of that I liked, and then I would go back with the view camera, and I would maybe take up 6 images, 6 locations, and then I'd edit it down to 2, because in one night shoot I could only do 2 points of view, because it was so it was so difficult to move a big 10K light or what have you. You just don't move it over very quickly. And then I needed, you need lots of things. You need insurance. You need help that's professional. And I had a gaffer, a man who was, a commercial cinematographer, and I would relate to him what I wanted, and then he would direct the team to do what I wanted. So there was like this, became very specialized very quickly. So it wasn't me alone dreaming it up. I had to orchestrate between professional people who could actually make it happen. And I'm finding that more and more in what I do. And so that experience was really valuable. For instance, in making any of these sculptures that I'm doing now, because especially the ones on the wall with the 3-dimensional pieces, that involves me making a photograph, relying on a printer, relying on a framer to put it all into a plexiglass box frame, working with an architect to, well, first, on top of that, then I design the elements that will project off the surface. And then I have a young architect who puts those elements into a plan that then I give to an architectural modeler who will cut the shapes and adhere it, glue it to the surface of the plexi. And so, you know, I can't do all of that. I don't want to do all of that. I really have to find people with expertise that I can trust to do it. So it becomes a very extensive and expensive project. And it's a different mindset to working alone in the studio. It's totally different. So every now and then, working alone in the studio is the relief that maybe you were talking about, to like let some of these things flow and then not have to always orchestrate it through some other person.
Barbara.
Oh.
We saw your piece in the warehouse, or a couple pieces.
Oh, good.
Really appreciate it, and the control you have over all of this, I've never, like, it didn't dawn on me, so I'm glad I'm here, but the shadows, the material, the light, the color, you were very controlled over all that. Is there anywhere in this whole process where there's an element of whimsy?
I'm a control freak. What can I say?
I kind of got that.
Well, the whimsy comes in my selection of color more than in the process, right? And the whimsy comes when something fell over and tore the backdrop, and I liked it, and I used it, right? So yeah, there's a little spontaneity in there, but it's never planned for, you know, yeah.
Well, I hate to cut us off, but
You can ask me later
Yeah.
when we're out there having
over a glass of wine. Yeah, so I do want to remind everyone that from 3:30 to 5:30, the warehouse is having an open house. So if you'd like to go up there, the address is in your program. And if you can't make it up there, come enjoy a glass of wine with us just in the back. Thanks.